Chapter 36. Jake had heard the gunshots and the pack howling in triumph, and he hurried in that direction because it was closer. His nose told him Amanda had been all around this area. They passed into a clearing and found 3 hunters, surrounded by the majority of the pack, cowering against each other. Their guns were scattered on the ground and 6 of the wolves were closing in, snarling and slathering with fangs bared. Through the far copse of trees Jake could see the big house where they'd been holding Amanda after shooting him the night before. He was so close, but he could smell that she'd already gone through this clearing and in another direction. Jake, Fred said beside him, frowning as he watched the wolves. They're going to kill those men. Let them, Jake said distractedly, sniffing at the air. Fuck those hunters. Jake. Fred shook his arm a little and Jake glared at him. You told me that there'd be no more killing on this mountain when I gave you Glenwood's information. Now he's dead. Jake bristled and looked over at the knot of hunters and wolves again. He didn't give a fuck about any of those men, and he certainly understood why. The wolves wanted to go at them with gnashing jaws. But then he sighed, because it was impossible not to think about Amanda and remember that she was right, that justice was the better way. And that's what Alistair had also agreed to in the end. Fine, he muttered at Fred. He started deeper into the clearing, making a beeline for the wolves and the hunters. Stop, he shouted. Don't kill them. They're to be. The wolves backed up, and the hunters turned themselves in a circle, and Jake saw Barry Sims huddled behind the other men, staring wide-eyed at the wolves. The beast in Jake's heart woke with a roar of fury. Barry looked right at Jake, and terror filled his expression. Unable to control himself as the rage of betrayal took over, the years and years of watching his people get skinned and left for dead overwhelmed his human senses. Dimly he heard Fred Jacobson telling him to calm down, felt the man's hand on his shoulder, but he shook it off and launched himself into a run right for Barry. The other wolves cleared out from between them and the hunters scrambled too, as Jake dove onto Barry and knocked him clear to the ground. Once there he didn't even shift, though the wolf wanted its revenge. And to taste blood on its fangs Jake didn't shift. Instead he wrapped his hands around Barry's throat and started to squeeze. Barry gasped, clawing at Jake's arms, but didn't have the strength to dislodge him. Jake planted his knees on Barry's chest, pinning him to the ground while he throttled the life out of him. Please, Barry wheezed. No. Stop. Jake could hear Fred shouting for him to stop, but he ignored them both. The wolves growled, but with a haze of red behind his eyes, he didn't care. All he cared about was killing the maggot beneath him, the betrayer who had helped these hunters kill his people. Jake bared his teeth and felt a satisfying surge of strength as he watched Barry's face start turning purple. He heard the sound of rifle shot as though it was underwater, clouded and far away but close at the same time, and he still didn't stop. Chapter 37. Amanda dropped the rifle and broke into a run. She trusted that Alistair and his wolves would keep Rufus in check as she ran towards Jake. She could see Barry's legs flopping as Jake choked him, and she knew she had to stop it. Her heart in her throat, she ran across the clearing. The other wolves had surrounded the remaining hunters again, and she saw Fred Jacobson directing them, keeping them from lunging, but Jake was ignoring him, too focused on murdering Barry. In a last-ditch, desperate effort, Amanda threw herself into Jake, knocking him off of Barry. The assistant me gasped for breath as she and Jake rolled across the ground, and then she heard Jake let out a furious growl of frustration. Then he was on top of her, hands gripping her, and she looked up into his face and was startled to see that his dark eyes had turned a wolfy gold. He was seething as he glared down at her, not seeing her at all. The relief she thought she'd feel upon seeing him alive turned sharply into terror, that he was going to hurt her without realizing it. Jake, she squeaked, struggling to get her hands free. Jake, it's me. Amanda. He bared his teeth but then blinked, lowering his head before sniffing a few times and shaking himself. With his head bowed he rolled his shoulders, all those powerful muscles shifting beneath bare skin, and when he lifted his head again his eyes were dark, the anger gone from his face. Amanda, he whispered, and her heart jumped in her chest when he looked into her eyes and began to calm down. Amanda, I'm sorry. No, she said, voice shaking. His grip on her loosened and she could lift her hands, touching his face. No, you're perfect. You're alive. He exhaled. You're alive. And she smiled. We're both alive. And I love you. Jake bent down and kissed her hard. Amanda felt that relief finally and desire all flooding through her body as she kissed him back. She loved him so much she thought her heart would burst. His mouth moved against hers and then the kiss broke and he tucked his face against her throat. She could feel him breathing hard against her skin and he shivered as she held on to him, gazing up at the sky and the filigree of trees lacing across it. Then she heard the awkward shuffling of feet nearby and had to laugh. Fred said. So, detective. She tilted her head and saw Alistair, naked and in his man form, holding the rifle she'd dropped. We have caught them all, and taken the house. Jake, Amanda whispered. We did it. They're all captured. Take the others to the house, Jake said, but his face was still against her throat, his voice muffled. Alistair smirked, looking down at them. We can secure them there. I'll call the cops, Fred suggested, nodding. He hesitated and Amanda saw something like a blush creep into his craggy features. It'll probably take them, a few hours to get here at least. Amanda nodded. That'd be good, Fred, thanks. Tell Captain Martin that Jake and I are safe and made the arrests, and that Mr. Sims over there was in on it all, and that I'll meet him when he gets here. Fred nodded. Yes, ma'am, detective. You got it. Then Fred and Alistair left her field of vision and moved off. The wolves snarled some more at the hunters, but soon enough all she could hear was the sound of her own heart beating in her ears and Jake's breathing. He still hadn't lifted his head. She brushed her fingers through his hair and turned her face to press a kiss to his temple. Are you all right? She asked him softly. She didn't mind at all just lying there beneath him in the grass. I thought you were dead, he whispered. Her throat tightened. I thought you were dead too. But you're not. And neither am I. And here we are together again. I'm sorry. I was going to kill him. I understand, she insisted. Ido. I get it. I wanted to kill them too,